I want to welcome you to our inaugural session in our new series entitled Where Justice Meets Action. This series is a space for deeper dialogue. It's an opportunity to share updates about the impact the Mississippi Center for Justice is making in our local communities, and an opportunity to engage with our donors, partners, and supporters on a more personal level. So I want to thank you not only for being here today, but also for your continued commitment to justice and equity in Mississippi. For those who may be new to this space, the Mississippi Center for Justice is a nonprofit, homegrown, public interest law firm dedicated to advancing racial and economic justice across the state of Mississippi. With offices in Jackson, Biloxi, and Indianola, MCJ tackles some of Mississippi's most pressing challenges through a multifaceted approach that includes legal advocacy, direct legal services, collaborating with strategic partnerships, community education, and media outreach. Our attorneys and professionals work to confront systemic discrimination and poverty through targeted efforts in health, education, economic justice, heirs property, civic engagement, impact litigation, and housing. Today's session will highlight our work in one of our key areas, our housing campaign. April is National Fair Housing Month, a time to recognize the landmark passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. This federal legislation prohibits discrimination in the rental and the sale of housing in the state of Mississippi. Well, really nationally, but we do the work here in Mississippi. MCJ is only one of two HUD-designated Fair Housing Initiative programs in Mississippi, serving 39 counties. Our housing team works to educate communities about the Fair Housing Act and their rights. We gather evidence of discriminatory practices and fair housing violations, and we challenge those violations, both of the law through administrative and legal action. I now would like to introduce you to Attorney Ashley Richardson, who serves as our Director of Housing and leads the housing campaign. Her team provides direct legal services, fights systemic discrimination, and educates Mississippians on their fair housing rights. A graduate of Rusk College, the University of Mississippi, and the University of Mississippi School of Law, Ashley brings legal expertise and a deep personal commitment to equity, community, and justice. She will now walk us through understanding the context of the Fair Housing Act and the work that MCJ advocates do to challenge violations of said act. Ashley?
Thank you so much, Kim. So the Fair Housing Act is a federal law that prohibits housing discrimination based off of 7 protected classes. Those classes are race, color, religion, national origin, sex, family status, and disability. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in the area of the sale, rental, and financing of housing discrimination. Although there are some exemptions under the Fair Housing Act, nearly all housing applies under the law. So this includes nursing homes, college dormitories, and basically any type of housing, also private housing, public housing, and federal funded housing. It also includes statements and advertisements that are made in regards to housing if it targets any of those 7 protected classes. The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, better known as HUD, enforces the Fair Housing Act. Through a grant provided by HUD, Mississippi Center for Justice serves as a FIP, better known as Fair Housing Initiatives Program. Under one of our grants provided through HUD, we go out into communities and let participants know what the Fair Housing Act is. We provide examples of violations of the law and how we can file complaints with HUD. Under another grant provided by HUD, called the PEI, Private Enforcement Initiative, we investigate claims of housing discrimination. We have an intake specialist who answers the phone with anyone who believes that their rights have been violated. She conducts an intake, and then a case is filed with an attorney, with MCJ. We talk with that client and we gather evidence to file an administrative complaint with HUD. Under this grant, we also have a testing program, one of the tools that HUD uses to see if there's also housing discrimination. With our test coordinator at MCJ, she trains testers, and what they do is they are assigned to certain complexes throughout Mississippi. We train them. If we're testing on the basis of sex, we will send a male and a female tester out. If we're testing on the basis of race, we could send a Black and a white tester out at different times. At this point, we are testing to see if both of those testers who are both looking to obtain housing receives the same treatment. Are they provided the same information? Are they provided the same availability? Did they receive all of the same information? We also can test on the basis of mortgage loans. We send people to banks also. We give them similar profiles to make sure that their backgrounds are correct. So with that, again, we're testing to see if they are provided the same information in regards to loan. Through our testing program, this is one of the key tools that we use to see if there's still discrimination here in Mississippi. And of course, as we have found, there is. As Kim explained, we serve 39 counties out of the 82 counties here in Mississippi. MCJ serves as one of 2 FIPs here in Mississippi. At this time, I'll return it over to Attorney Ian Gustafson to talk about one of our recent success stories in regards to the Fair Housing Act.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you everybody for joining us. We wanted to illustrate the fair housing work by talking about a very typical and representative case, and that's the case of Mr. Lancaster, who lives in Biloxi and who we represented earlier this year and at the end of last year. I want to preface this by briefly explaining an important part of the FHA that Ashley touched on a little more. The Act says that landlords must make reasonable accommodations for persons with disabilities in their housing. That means they have to make changes to rules, policies, or procedures if those changes are necessary to afford that person with disabilities the opportunity to enjoy and utilize their housing like anybody else would. A classic example of that would be a building that doesn't allow pets, making an exception to that policy to allow somebody with a service animal to bring their animal there. The Act also says that landlords must allow reasonable modifications to their housing to afford a person with disabilities the opportunity to utilize their housing like anyone else would. And an example of that would be lowering the countertops or light switches in a unit to allow a person in a wheelchair to reach them. So Mr. Lancaster, who, as I said, lives in Biloxi, is blind and he uses a wheelchair for mobility. And he called our housing stability hotline in the summer of 2024, complaining that his landlord was refusing to put up accessible parking signs and refusing to allow him to modify his unit to accommodate his disabilities. And he was just getting back to independent living. He had suffered a series of medical events and had been in a rehabilitation facility for some time. So he really needed changes made to his apartment to allow him to get around. For example, he needed grab bars by his toilet and shower. He needed a wheelchair ramp to get in and out the door, a little rope that he could pull to get himself over the threshold in his wheelchair. He also had a seriously stressful parking, stressful and dangerous parking situation where there was no accessible parking at this whole big apartment complex. And he has a van that picks him up for medical appointments and grocery shopping and that sort of thing. And most of the time, because there's no accessible space, he had to wheel himself into the middle of this parking lot and impede traffic with the loading process, which takes some time. And that agitated other tenants and potentially put him at risk. At the very least, it was embarrassing and stressful for him to deal with. And the property managers there would just tell him over and over, because he had been requesting these changes for well over a year by the time he contacted us. And they would just tell him over and over that the signs were back ordered or they'd be up soon or not to worry about it. And again, that went on for over a year. So we had first tried to, when the case came to us, we tried to work it out with the property managers, but they gave us the same song and dance. So we had to file a fair housing complaint with HUD alleging discrimination on the basis of disability. We represented Mr. Lancaster through the process, furnishing evidence to HUD and engaging in settlement talks. And eventually we came to a settlement that included a healthy monetary settlement for Mr. Lancaster, the installation of accessible parking throughout his apartment complex and the changes he asked for, and that HUD would monitor the complex and mandate fair housing training for all the property management employees, among other things. The owner of the complex actually seemed mortified when he found out about the treatment that Mr. Lancaster had suffered, and he was really apologetic. And to me, this is such a typical case where the property management doesn't really know their responsibilities under the law, and their apathy or disdain for persons with disabilities leads to the effective denial of these requests for accommodations or modifications that allow them to live safely and happily in their housing. We've found that fully 57% of fair housing complaints are filed on the basis of disability in recent years, and oftentimes it's because of these denials of reasonable accommodations. And several of the active cases we have now are denials of reasonable accommodation requests. So we work in the community to try to educate property managers on their responsibilities, and we're of course there to enforce the act when violations occur, but we also try to prevent them from happening in the first place. We also go out into the community to try to educate people on their rights so that they can come to us when these violations do happen. It was only because the community leader in Biloxi told Mr. Lancaster to call us about a FHA violation that he was able to have this outcome. So the community education and outreach piece of our work is so crucial. That was Mr. Lancaster's case, and at this time, we'd like to open the floor to any questions the audience might have about Mr. Lancaster or the act or our work. And I think you can either type in the chat or raise your virtual hand.
I want to pause to see if anyone has any questions. All right, well, I just wanted to highlight the fact that the work that the Center for Justice does around fair housing includes educating the community. And as Ian said, that includes educating property owners, both private and public, apartment complex owners, because the reality is a lot of these people do not know the law. They don't know that there's a federal law that protects against discrimination of people with disabilities, that protects against discriminating based on someone's race. We see cases where mothers with children get discriminated against. Folks don't want to sometimes rent to people with families, particularly single moms tend to be targeted in these areas. And as Ashley said earlier, when we see something like this or someone reports it to us, then that's why we have a testing program. This is the program where we send someone out. Maybe we send out a woman with kids to see how she's treated versus someone who's single. We'll send out a male to see if he's treated differently from a woman. We can send out someone who is Latino versus to see if they're being treated differently than someone who is Black or someone who's white. And so this work is critical. I also want to point out that the Fair Housing Act is a federal law. And the reality is the federal government does not have the capacity to handle these cases in every state. And so that's the importance of having a Fair Housing Initiative program. And as we said earlier, MCJ is one of 2 of those programs here in Mississippi. And it's critical. Without that, then people don't have a space to challenge these potential discriminatory acts when they occur. You just dropped into the chat pod how if you want to become a fair housing tester and your community can sign up here at the Mississippi Center for Justice to be one of those people that get sent out to hopefully gather evidence to see whether or not any allegation of discrimination actually occurs. All right, I want to thank Ashley and Ian for highlighting the Fair Housing Act's critical protections and illustrating our work's real-life impact through Mr. Lancaster's powerful story. What they shared is a reminder of why this work matters and why it must continue. I want to take a moment to speak candidly about the challenges that we've been facing here at the Center for Justice. In 2014, MCJ secured over $12 million in federal funding across several of our campaigns, including fair housing, with nearly 1.8 million of that money being incorporated in our 2025 operating budget. That represents about 25% of our overall budget. An executive order that attacks critical housing protection in an attempt to prohibit activities primarily related to gender identity and sexual orientation has now halted and even put at risk some of our funding. In response, HUD has both halted any complaints related to gender identity, or sexual orientation, although this is the federal law. MCJ is one of, like I said earlier, 2 fair housing initiative programs in the state of Mississippi. These federal grants fund these programs because they don't have the capacity to challenge them themselves and enforce the fair housing violations in every state. The federal government has terminated the other program in the state of Mississippi. So right now, MCJ is it. Now, we at this point have not received any formal termination notice from HUD, but we also haven't received any clarity. We've been informed that we could, continue to seek reimbursement from the federal government up through January of this year, with no additional sort of clarity or guidance around what to do past January. So we're operating on a shifting ground, doing the work without knowing when or if we will in fact be reimbursed by the federal government. Mississippi already has a thin Fair Housing Act infrastructure, and that will be severely weakened by the loss of funding. Vulnerable families who rely on those people like Mr. Lancaster to protect their rights would pay the price. Make no mistake though, MCJ will not back down. With or without this federal funding, we will find a way to continue to do our Fair Housing Act. The reality is that we face real limitations in our ability to investigate these claims, to file these complaints, and support communities facing housing discrimination without this funding. So we need it, but we will find a way regardless. That's why your presence here today is critical. Your support ensures that we can continue the fight here in Mississippi, no matter what happens in Washington. I'm asking you to raise your voice with the Mississippi Center for Justice and consider a donation, no matter how small or how big. If you live in Mississippi, you can also become involved by being a fair housing tester. And they will give you the link to both become a fair housing tester and make a donation if you choose to. We are stronger together, and I'm asking you to help us ensure that Mississippians have a fair and equal opportunity to secure safe and affordable housing. Thank you again for joining us today, and this concludes our program. We will have a follow-up to this that will give you more information about fair housing, letting you know how you can be a tester as well as contributing. We have some other events that are happening that are coming up in April the 26th. In Cleveland, Mississippi, we have a Know Your Rights clinic around children with special education. In Hattiesburg on April the 29th, we have a fair housing training for industry people. Folks who work in the fair housing industry can get more education around understanding fair housing so that we won't see as many challenges as we see. And then we have our signature event. If there's anyone here today who is on the East Coast, we will have one of our signature events called Mississippi on the Potomac on June 11th in Washington, D.C. All right, if you want more information, you can either click on this QR code or go to www.mscenterforjustice.org for more information about fair housing, our other campaigns, about making a really small reoccurring donation. We'll take your $5 every month if you're willing to do that for us. We'll take a $500 check if you're willing to do that. Believe me, it counts, it adds up, and it helps us continue to do the work that we do. Thank you again for joining us. If you need us, you know how to reach us. Have a great weekend.